Good morning, everyone. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of Seth Kaplan's important new book, Fragile Neighborhoods. Americans live now with an awareness that our society confronts a kind of crisis, a breakdown of social order that presents itself in a wide variety of forms and symptoms. There have been a lot of efforts in recent years to diagnose and to understand that problem, and some efforts also to find ways to address it, to mitigate it, to speak to it in practical terms. Seth Kaplan's book is a major contribution to both of those efforts, and I think it stands out in particular for linking them, for looking for a better understanding of the problems we face by thinking about what works in our society and what's required for more people to flourish. It's really a profound book in terms of both theory and practice, and it is our subject for this hour. We'll discuss it with the author. Seth Kaplan is an expert in fragile states. He teaches at SAIS at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's done a lot of work over the years in many countries around the world. He has advised the World Bank and the State Department, among others. Lately, he's turned his attention to his expertise built up in fragile states around the world has turned them homeward and has thought more about the American situation and what we might learn from applying some of the tools that help us understand fragile states to thinking about our own society, including its fragile neighborhoods. We'll proceed very simply. Seth will talk about the book for a while, then he and I will discuss it, and then we'll take some questions here in the room as well as online. If you're watching online, you can ask questions either through Twitter or by emailing us, and you see both ways to do that right next to where you're watching us now. And with that, we'll begin. Seth, please.
Thank you, Yuval. Let me thank Yuval and thank everybody at AEI, because I do read so much of your work, and it is a real pleasure and honor to be here among you today. So, I wrote this book. We were just talking a little bit before we started. To write a book, you have to feel really like a very, very strong emotion. Otherwise, why will you spend years and years of your life and all that time hidden in your cave, climbing the walls, trying to get those words out? I wrote this book out of a lot of a great concern of our society and a great concern that we don't sufficiently understand what is going on in our society and what we might do about it. And for me, this is the single biggest domestic challenge we face. And I want to particularly say that my focus from the beginning is on solutions. There's a lot of books on diagnosis, but I'm here to try to create a framework of solutions. And I'm very focused on place, which I think is not sufficiently appreciated. So, my day job including now, and in fact, what I'm most known in Washington is for my work on fragile states. So I have visited all those countries in green, and I have worked on 30 to 35 countries. I literally am working day in and day out, particularly on Libya and Nigeria, and I visit countries like this all the time. And when I come to this problem, I'm really bringing this comparative lens and years of work. So those are three books or documents that I've worked on. The left is my first book, which is the first book written on fragile states and sort of made my name in that field. That's 15 years ago. The middle is a report by the United Nations and the World Bank. It is the single only joint report ever produced by those two organizations. And I wrote the concept chapter and was senior advisor on that. And the right is one of many publications I've done for an organization I co-manage that works in about a dozen countries around the world. And the key thing is I work on all these countries, and then around 2015, 2016, 2017, people in Washington think of me, you're the fragile states guy. What is going on with the United States? Are we also a fragile state? So I got this question at coffee. I got this question at coffee here. I got this question in meetings. I got this question on the street. People would see me. They would walk up to me. And this question just came up too many times for me to ignore it. And I set off on this journey. I've had this previous journey of traveling around the world and working around the world. So I spent many years thinking about this question, researching the question, and visiting different parts of America. And just to give you an idea, my lens for thinking about this question is always the idea that relationships is the starting point for understanding any country. When I work in Libya, I work in Nigeria, I work in the United States, we must always remember that the nature of relationships informs institutions, affects politics, society, economics. So I had this question, and I read a lot of books, and what we find from lots and lots of these books are that, I have a bookcase. I took all the books that I had read when I finished this book, and I needed to buy a bookcase. My wife did not want another bookcase in the living room. I can assure you of that, but I didn't have 10 books, I had 50 books. And believe me, there are a lot of books. The problem with these books are they're either lamenting where we are or they're diagnosing, and some of them are great. I want to particularly say Bob Putnam's work. I have read his work for 30 years, from his work starting on Italy and his many books on the United States. And the stuff is great and the data is great. The problem is, what do we do with this idea that our relationships are thinning out, our institutions are in decay, and everyone tries to grope for answers, and they don't really have answers. His best answer is family dinners. And as anyone who knows me personally, I am really big on family dinners. I'll even fly at 5 in the morning to ensure that I have a family dinner the night before. And so it's critical, but family dinners are not going to take us back from where we are. So what do we do about it? Again, if we think that relationships are the heart and the key element that we need to study to understand the nature of a society. When I work in Nigeria, when I work in Libya, when I work in Somalia, Sri Lanka, wherever it might be, and when I think about the United States, we must always start, what is the nature of relationships and different parts of society and how that feeds into everything else. So if we're thinking that America had a pretty healthy society 2 generations ago, and we don't have a healthy society now, what has changed? And I think the best way to understand this is that we used to have, and I think all of human history has seen, that people live, for the most part, in bounded community, bounded place-based community. There's a lot of, these are not perfect. They have challenges, they have problems. They may discriminate, they may constrain, but the key thing is they have lots of institutions. They have lots of networks. They have lots of relationships, and they overlap. This overlap part is very important. And therefore, there's this, I feel in my neighborhood, I live in a neighborhood that's very much like this, and you feel when you walk around that you have a security blanket around you. That is not a government policy. That is not a program. That is the fact that I walk down the street and I know who lives behind those doors. I know if there's a problem, and I can talk about personal experience. I can run to someone's house. My 2 kids got to school today because of 2 neighbors, because my wife is away taking care of family, and I needed help. So I had neighbors to call on. When you live in a place with thick institutions, you have those types of relationships. Today, we live in a society based on networks. Networks are very dynamic. Networks are very agile. Our economy has benefited tremendously from moving from place-based life to network-based life. I think nobody would dispute that many more people have opportunity that might not have opportunity 60 years ago. We can talk about the race, we can talk about gender, we can talk about many things that place-based communities constrain. The problem, however, is when you live in a society based on networks, you end up with a lot of places that do not have good networks. You end up with a lot of people that have no networks or limited networks. I myself can speak at every point in my career, how far I could go depended upon the nature of my network. And people who are extremely good at networks, who they go to the particular school, they get involved in a particular organization. they have a particular career, they end up in great networks. Well, if you live in Eastern Kentucky or you live in a particular neighborhood in a city, you probably have the wrong networks or no networks, and that has enormous implications for how we experience life. And we have to remember, how do Americans experience life every day? I think there's a lot of people who are experiencing life like this. If you think back 2 generations, an abundance of institutions everywhere, people had a sense of agency. They had a stake. They belonged to an institution. They had a way to contribute to where they lived. They had a completely different feeling of daily life because each place had an abundance of institutions. Many, many more people were involved in these institutions. People had a stake in their neighborhoods and in their communities, and they had a way to improve them, and it gave them a stake in our society. Fast forward to today, there are tens and tens of millions of Americans who feel no agency, who feel things are being done to them. Just think about nonprofit life as an example. Nonprofit life used to be local, used to be a lot of volunteers. It used to involve people doing with each other. Now it's basically professional organizations doing to people. The whole point is people's experience of life has been transformed, and that has enormous implications. Lifespan is a very crude measurement of well-being, but it tends to be a very good measurement, even though it's a bit crude, because obviously other factors, you see the COVID impact. The key point for me from this is not the COVID impact, it's that our average lifespan diverged and began to diverge and has increasingly diverged from other wealthy developed countries over 40 years ago. That means something is happening in our society that's affecting the well-being of significant number of people. We hear about deaths of the spear. For me, one of the biggest news items in the United States are the number of people dying of drug overdoses. Twice as many Americans die of a drug overdose in 1 year that died in the Vietnam War over 20 years. I mean, that is an incredible statistic, and yet we can almost not tell it is occurring by the newspaper. But that has an enormous impact on that. And that goes back in many ways. Again, there's many, many factors. I can't say the supply doesn't matter, but when you have a thinning out of relationships, a thinning out of institutions, this is the result. Another incredible statistic for me is the gap between us and other developed countries on the status of children. This is not a gap of marriage. I know we spend a lot of time on marriage, and I write a lot about marriage in my book because I think marriage is really important. The gap between the EU and the US on marriage with 5 and under kids is 3 percentage points. The gap on 2-parent households is 17.5%. That means in Europe, especially Northern Europe, people don't get married, but they stay with their kids. In America, we have, I hate to say, we have great disconnection between parents and, I mean, fathers in particular, of course, and children. And this, just to imagine how almost 1/3 of our kids, how they're experiencing life as they grow up. I mean, I have kids. I think many of you have kids. What is the single most important thing for a baby and a small child every day? It's that security blanket. It's that love. And so the question is, how much love and how much security are people feeling in their relationships? One more data point. This report came out earlier this year from the Surgeon General. I think it's really important that we talk about loneliness and isolation, and I'm so happy they did this. However, we need to stop thinking of each of these problems that I'm mentioning, and the problem of mistrust, and the problem of polarization, and the problem of mental illness and depression. These are not separate problems. We silo them and we hand them over to policymakers and professionals. We need to think of them as being downstream from a common source. So, my book focuses on place. That is the place, and neighborhoods and place-based institutions is what has changed the most. An abundance of institutions to, in some places, no institutions, actually. Think of lifespan. There is a gap of over 40 years between neighborhoods on average lifespan. I was just speaking to a healthcare provider east of Kansas City a couple of weeks ago, and they were telling me 2 neighboring counties, both suburbs, 20-year gap in lifespan. So something about place is having an enormous impact on well-being. This is from Harvard. This is Jack Shonkoff's work, if you know who he is, one of the leading experts on developing children. And very clearly, the conclusion is that place matters. And I want to notice those rings. The key thing is the inner ring is relationships and institutions. The second level, which I make a point of saying, the built environment. We cannot affect how the built environment and the other institutions in our society is affecting our relationships. Policy and culture is the third ring. And yet, for the most part, we spend all of our time debating policy and culture. And for me, it's the middle and especially the inner ring that has enormous implications for the well-being of people. This is children. It's the same for all of us. This is the neighborhood effect. This is not a new idea. It's about 45 years old. This is Raj Chetty, who I think many of you may know, has done great work quantifying the neighborhood effect in terms of social mobility and life outcomes. But I want to tell you that social poverty is not only a problem of poor people. I can tell you that I know, go to the Amish, go to some religious communities, go to recent immigrant communities. You can find socially rich, economically poor places, and you can go to a lot of well-off neighborhoods. I'm thinking 10-minute drive from where I live, wonderfully nice houses. There's nothing that connects those people. There's just roads, there's green areas, there's pathways, places for your dog, places for your bicycle. Where are the institutions that bring those people together? You drive to church, you drive to school, you drive shopping, your civic engagement is not local. There's nothing that brings people together. This is a colleague of people who work here, and she and many other people have noticed this. I don't think what I'm saying is novel, but I want to point out it goes back to neighborhood. Your neighborhood determines so much about what goes on in the social life and what goes on indirectly on how you are feeling and everything about your life. Neighborhoods have a huge impact on society and individual well-being. Many of our social ills sit downstream from neighborhoods. We all live in a place. I can assure you that everybody sitting here or watching, you all live in a place. I don't think there's nothing novel about that. But you have to think, we have built a placeless society. We have physically and institutionally built a placeless society. Every place should have an identity and a sense that you have a stake in it, and therefore you are a part of the larger society. If it's placeless, what are you but an autonomous individual or household? This is a good picture. House upon house upon house, nothing bringing people together. Institutions are the same. I mentioned nonprofits, but think of government. I live in Montgomery County. The main government above me is Montgomery County. If you live in a city, what is there between the individual and the government, the city government? It could be millions of people, except if you live in a small town. Government is distant, nonprofits is distant, people are going to church far away, you're going to Walmart and you're shopping. There's nothing that brings people together. And so the big question, which I'm trying to address in my book, is what can we do about it? Again, we want to go back and think, we're not going to go back to the past, but how could we think about society that you return more to this? We need strong overlapping institutions, place by place. We need a supportive landscape. I mean, clearly what I'm talking about is not going to happen overnight, but if we think about relationships and the institutions and the physical landscape that shapes them, it requires somewhat a rethinking about these problems and a rethinking about how we might address them. And the big question we need to always ask, what can strengthen neighborhood relationships at scale? And that is the question. And I researched lots of organizations. I'm going to go through one very quickly here. This is a thread in Baltimore. Again, I look for solutions, so I looked at organizations at the front line of this work. Now, Sarah Heminger here and her husband Ryan, they grew up in Indiana. They both had very difficult times in their during their childhoods. And Sarah's time was she was a member of a close-knit church community, but they had problems with the pastor at some point. They were ostracized. They might have been very isolated and alone, but their family was very strong. She got through trouble because of a strong family. Her husband, father ended up in jail. Mother had an accident. They went into poverty from being materially okay or well off, and ended up, he was close to failing out of school. People at the school intervened. Again, we're talking about institutions here. People in the school came up and created like a family network to support him. Again, institutions are what keeps us from being vulnerable, as well as helping us get to places that we want to go. These are examples of two institutions. She ended up going to get her PhD at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, but she was lonely. She felt isolated. She was materially fine. Again, strong family background like everyone else, but she felt socially poor. I don't think she would use that term. And she would go by every day on the way to school, this high school. This high school is in Baltimore. You can imagine like a typical Baltimore high school, a lot of family breakdown, a lot of problems in the school, a lot of problems outside the school. And she asked herself, could she replicate the help that her husband received? So the big question for her is she wanted to help these kids. How do you overcome the insanity going on outside the school? Again, if we want to think about the challenges facing us in our society, we must always put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are experiencing it. That's rule number one in any work that I do. Put myself in the shoes of people. So she thinks about these people, family unstable, street unstable, insecure. Literally, there's insanity going on outside the school. How can they possibly do well inside of school? And her answer was create a family-like social support system. Again, we're talking about this type of some sort of safety net in the society that supports people. It's the key issue. I see it every day in my neighborhood. I could give 10, 15, 25 examples of just people doing things for each other. Create a family-like social support system, just like her husband had experienced. And this is, so she's literally creating an institution. The students, volunteers, and they're not just helping them as most organizations might. They are a family. They're available 24/7. They're available at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's part of the commitment. They're there to drive them to school. They're there to make sure they have food. They're there every single day. The volunteers might evolve over time, but for 10 years, 24/7, and so you have that institution around the kids, and then you have them all threaded together. So you have a whole series of institutions that sees building to ensure that those kids, the key thing is people need love. I mean, it's such the most basic concept. We need love. I live in a neighborhood where I have a couple of good friends, but I have hundreds of neighbors that I just have enough of a relationship with that we trust each other. We're there for each other. I wouldn't quite call it love, but it's a security blanket. I have a neighbor, my daughter's best friend had chemo this year, lost all of her hair, could have been an awful experience, but the neighborhood rallied around her. The community school rallied around her. She was in my house how many times in the last few months? She was in my house yesterday, the day before. But the key point is people come together, and what might have been an awful experience actually was a positive experience because so much support. So the thing is, unconditional love is transformative, and too few Americans are experiencing it. Again, her organization is very systematic, and we know all these things matter, bonding, bridging, linking, in terms of what they do to ensure the success of those kids. She takes them as ninth graders, 10-year commitment until they're 25, and they're the worst performers in some already pretty bad schools. Relationships are the key things that bring about change. Again, if you address social isolation, whether it's material poverty, material wealth, but if you address social isolation, and her program helps wealthy or materially well-off people also address their socialization. This is not a help. This is together. We are doing things together. It's just an idea, a model. And the results are really, really, really incredible because you have kids who weren't on the trajectory to graduate high school. They had under 1 GPAs. I think it was about 0.7 GPAs. And now a significant percent, I think here it is, 57% are creating post-secondary education. I mean, this is incredible. Again, this is about relationships, institutions supporting people, something that we all need to thrive. And in terms of my research, just to bring this whole presentation together, these are some, I go through this, and then I have some cross-cutting conclusions. This slide is only giving you sort of the surface, but I think, for example, let me just mention the last point. We often think about what government can do, and we often say decentralization is important. I think we don't quite understand what decentralization is. I recommend that instead of housing going from federal to state to local, or healthcare going from federal to state to local, we need to step aside from this whole idea that government should be structured around functions. Why is government not structured around places? If we structure around functions, we're always going to be seeking more units of those functions. If government was structured around place-based teams and place-based results, government would have a different way of working. It's one idea. So each of these we could open up and get into more detail. A flourishing society needs to be built on flourishing neighborhoods. And I argue that the big problems we face, there is not a magic bullet. I'm not arguing there's a magic bullet, but we need to address them place by place. We need a lot of smaller, this is Dreama Gentry, an incredible woman from Eastern Kentucky, who I also looked into and researched. And I think this says it all very well. And what can you do? And this is simply my recommendations for readers. Each of us can think about how we can prioritize differently in our lives. And my argument is the more we focus on building up the local, the more we shift a lot of our focus, not from distant campaigns and distant things on social media, we reorient Americans more and more towards the local, the practical, the tangible, doing things with each other, the more we will solve our bigger problems. And there's the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Seth. It's wonderful, and this is really an extraordinary book. It's in a way, it's almost like an inside-out version of all those books that you mentioned that have come out in the last few years about the country's problems. Where, and it didn't escape my notice that a couple of those are mine, and it's true. Those books diagnose at length, they offer big theories, and then there's a final chapter, which usually is put there because the publisher insisted on it. It says, what can we do? And there's like 3 things, and you think, this is what we can do with that problem? Your book is really the other way around. It's a book about what we can do and what people are doing. And I want to think a little bit about how you get from the broad diagnosis to that very practical question of what we can do. And maybe to get there by way of thinking about a couple of the terms that you use. The book is called Fragile Neighborhoods. What is a neighborhood?
So I'm not sure most Americans live in neighborhoods. We all used to live in neighborhoods once upon a time. Human civilization was basically built organically, neighborhood. It could be a town, it could be parts of a city, but my definition of a neighborhood, a real neighborhood, it has to have a center, it has to have an identity, it has to have thick institutions, it should have ideally boundaries. We don't really build neighborhoods that way, but boundaries. It should have mechanisms that bring people together. Again, I list some institutions, I'm sure there's others. The key point is it's a place that nurtures some level of community. It might not be a thick community, but it's some level of bonding, some level of common destiny, some level that I have a stake in this place. And that stake in the place gives us agency, gives us opportunity, gives us support. So few of us have that day in and day out.
So, is there such a thing as a rural neighborhood, or does this assume a kind of closeness that's fundamentally urban and suburban? You know, Peter Berger, the sociologist, used to say that when you take your dog out for a walk, the furthest you'll go is the extent of your neighborhood. And beyond that, and you know, implicitly, people have a mental map of what is my neighborhood, and that's where they'll go on a walk. But of course, a lot of the problems you're describing are rural problems. You talk about those in the book. What is a rural neighborhood?
So clearly, neighborhoods are easier to say in urban and suburban. The term doesn't quite fit rural. I have a chapter on rural. Again, I think I'm stretching the term a little bit here because I do believe the problems I look at are urban, rural, and suburban. You could even say Native American reservations. They're not neighborhoods, but they have many of the same problems I describe. And I do think the vision I'm laying out is attempting to address this problem in some sort of comprehensive nature. But in a rural area, clearly you're not walking your dog to all your neighbors. If I go to Eastern Kentucky, your neighborhood is going to mean you're going up and down those hills. It's certainly not the county because the county is huge, but it's likely a part of a county. Ideally, there's some center. In many places, the only center might be the county seat. But I do believe that we need to think of these problems. So neighborhoods doesn't quite fit. Again, I'm stretching the term, but I do believe the types of problems I'm describing exist in all these places. So I do agree that it's a bit of a stretch of the term.
Help us think about the kind of importing of the concept of fragility from your work on fragile states to this kind of work. You said people would go around asking you, is the United States a fragile state now? What's the answer to that question? Is what you're describing what makes those fragile states, Libya and Nigeria and elsewhere, fragile, or is this something distinct and different?
It's similar but different, and so I'm going to answer that. So when I work on a country, what makes my work different than most people think of the problem of countries through policy or technical or what I would call a vertical lens. The United Nations is in Libya. It's trying to get the one peace agreement that will solve all the problems in the country. I have never believed that is feasible, and I'm not a big believer in vertical solutions, so to speak, top down, but also that could be bottom up by itself. So when I work on fragile states, I'm really working on fragile societies. I'm thinking about social cohesion. I'm thinking about bridging mechanisms. I'm thinking about the nature of relationships between different parts of society. And I've spent 15 plus years writing books, writing articles, writing strategy documents for organizations, explaining how we think that way and do something about it. When people ask me about the United States, their immediate thought was the state, the government, the nature of our democracy. And coming back on the plane from Sri Lanka or Nigeria and landing in Washington, it's very hard for me to think of the United States as fragile in the same way. Great companies, a big nonprofit sector, constitutional government for over 200 plus years. We are not fragile in that way. However, if you contrast what happens locally now and in the past, and what happens locally now and in many of the countries I work in, what you've seen is, again, this problem of relationships. It's a little bit different entry point to think about the nature of the problem of relationships, but when you're looking for the center of gravity of the problems of a country, you're always trying to find where is it that the relationships have the biggest challenge, the biggest problem. And I think a lot of people are focused on polarization. They're focused on the bigger challenges of our country. And my argument is those problems are real, and there are things we can do nationally, but we need to go upstream to, again, think about how are people experiencing life day in and day out, and what has changed in their relationships. That, to me, is the biggest change that people experience. So in answer to your question, my conclusion is, yes, we're a fragile society, and Somalia and Nigeria are also fragile societies. The fragile society part is in a different center of the country. It's a different type of problem. It's more micro and less macro. But I do believe it has great implications for our economy and our politics and our nature of our policy. It just won't mean that we're going to have the types of problems that Nigeria. I mean, when I'm in Nigeria, I have to worry about being kidnapped when I go on the road. And so I can't go on the road at certain times of day. We don't have those types of problems, but we do have pockets of insecurity. We do have enormous social problems that are just shocking if you really look at it in the perspective of other countries. And so we need to always look. We are definitely a fragile society. I don't think we're a fragile state yet, but it could be that if this keeps up and it continues for several generations, we will become a fragile state as well.
So we're a fragile society where the fragility is localized, and we're a huge society, a large country.
330 million people, it's huge.
How then can we think about this problem as a problem to be addressed? What's really striking in your book is you try to get people to a place where they can think about action to be taken. Given the scale of our society and the localized nature of the problems you describe, how do you build a bridge there where individuals who want to do something can get themselves to a place where they can see their way to action? What do solutions begin? Where do solutions begin?
Well, first, I think, while I think policy matters, I think we need to think really hard that the problem is one of structures and institutions and not of policy. Again, policy can be helpful, but when we're looking at a gross deinstitutionalization of social life in the United States, which is really what has occurred in the last 2 generations, policy is a limited tool for addressing that. We need to think about how we nurture and regenerate institutions and structures within our society. That, to me, is the fundamental challenge we face. And I focus on neighborhoods, not because that's easy, but that is where institutions have to start. They're not going to start by having some big organization, whether it's government or nonprofit, go and actually do something that helps people come together. It's going to require lots and lots of generation or regeneration of institutions place by place by place. This is not easy, but I do think there's certain things we can do. Certainly, one thing that my book argues is that we need to think hard of finding successful cases and helping them grow horizontally across the country. So I found 5. I found 5 in 5 different entry points for change, place by place. And one of my arguments is that we need to help, and several of them already are becoming, we need to help these organizations become trans-local. Not national, not regional, trans-local. That means they have chapters or they have local affiliates, whatever it is. One of them, for example, Communio, works with churches across the country. And churches are a great entry point for helping address these problems because churches are everywhere, more or less. And churches are very local. And churches should be more committed to their place and more committed to community building and more committed to strengthening institutions than they currently are. And I did make that argument when I spoke a couple weeks ago at the National Association of Evangelical, whatever their biannual meeting. I do believe that it's really important that we look for local success stories. Another example of things that we can do, if we think about things differently, I mentioned this idea that government needs to be less about functions and more about ensuring that places succeed, places flourish. That means different data, different measurements of success. That might mean some radical rethinking of the structure of government. I'm not saying that's more money. I'm not saying that's less money. I'm saying it's a different way government thinks of its job. Imagine instead of you're in the housing department, you're in the neighborhood X department, and there was a team of 10 people there, and they were being evaluated on the flourishing of that neighborhood. And they were going to be in that job for many, many years, and the other departments reported to you. This is something Jane Jacobs wrote about 60 years ago. I only discovered that after I wrote my book. But just imagine that government was about successful places and not about more units. Another idea, imagine that philanthropy, there was an incentive for philanthropy for you to do things locally. That could be incentivizing volunteer work. That could be incentivizing giving to organizations that were local. I mean, another idea is that we rethink the physical landscape so that every place is a distinct neighborhood with distinct boundaries and distinct center. That's a long way from where we are now, but there's a whole movement that's committed to some elements of that new urbanism. New urbanists very much like this work because they're committed to thinking much more about the physical landscape in a social manner. I think they need to go further, but it is a whole movement committed to making our landscape better for relationships. So I do think there's a lot of things we can do if we think about our problems in a different manner.
How much of this is making up for the breakdown of family? And what can other institutions really do to make up for what family provides?
Family is clearly very important. Of the 5 organizations I look at, one is focused on marriage and one is focused on family structure. And the data on how family structure impacts everything else going in the neighborhood, I think the data is really clear. But I do think there is a dynamic here between place and family structure that we need to appreciate. If you go to a neighborhood and families, and basically every family is weak or every family is unstable, whatever you want to call it. Family breakdown is the paramount. I mean, I can remember visiting, I don't write about this, but I remember visiting a neighborhood in Shreveport, and I went into there was an establishment there trying to strengthen this specific neighborhood. And they had on the wall of their main community room the marriage certificate of the couple that was running that center. Why did they put their marriage certificate in the wall of the community center? Because nobody in the neighborhood believed that they were actually married. They had almost never met a family in which the parents were married. So I do believe if you're in such a place, it's really hard to address this problem of marriage. So again, if there was less a concentration of these problems in specific places, you will see better outcomes on marriage. Not that the marriage question is not very important. I also think if we are deinstitutionalizing social life in so many ways, that has no choice. That inevitably will affect our affiliation with religion, our affiliation with family, our affiliation with children. Yes, these things it's a cycle, but this disaffiliation or this deinstitutionalization has gross implications for family life, for faith. I think we need to think of these things as a part of a system, and they're all impacting each other. Yes, it would be great if we could have stronger families, and I think we need to emphasize that, but we need to think that a single family is not in isolation. I'll just give my personal example. My personal family, has had loads of problems at times. My wife and I, my kids, my in-laws. We won't talk about my in-laws, but I live in a neighborhood where I have intimate relationships with lots of neighbors. So I have a lot of support. I have a lot of people telling me their own problems. The key thing is when you have support in countless ways, and also when you see the problems of other people and other households, you immediately begin to think that your problems are not so bad. And so the idea that a neighborhood is so important for the success of a family, of a marriage, and of kids, I mean, there's data on that. Of course, marriage matters. Of course, family matters. But we need to not look at things in a silo. We need to think of ecosystem, context, and how it affects those.
It's interesting. You talk about religion in a similar way in the book. We tend to think about religious disaffiliation or declines in faith commitments, and you highlight that those are actually individualistic ways of thinking about religion.
Yes.
And you think about religion more in terms of community action and practice. Tell us a little bit about what American religion looks like from that point of view, and what's the connection between the number of Americans saying they don't believe or they're not affiliated and the kinds of problems you're describing here?
I mean, what I find fascinating about American religion, again, I have foreign eyes given my background. I lived outside this country for over a dozen years, and I travel a lot. I mean, American religion is often, to me, just another consumer product. You go, you hear the sermon, you sometimes have functional networks, a network around school, a network around this. There's no community. If you read Charles Taylor, Secular Age, and he describes what life was like 500 years ago to what life was like now, and he's got this incredible contrast. 500 years ago, it would be really hard not to think that you were religious because you lived in a whole ecosystem that supported this whole understanding. And today you live in a completely different ecosystem. So I don't think we can think about the decline of religion as in isolation from all these things are happening in parallel. Therefore, there must be something going on across all these things that are affecting it. If religion is simply 2 hours on a Sunday and a couple of other elements, I'm not in a religious community. I'm not in a religious culture. I'm in the other culture, and my religion is just a consumer product. How is that sustainable over time? That's not very sustainable over time. That's very hard to pass on because the values of faith are not the predominant values that people are experiencing, especially when you're growing up. So I believe this idea that we have shrunk religion. Religion to me in America is a very thin idea. It's a shrunken idea. It is not faith as I understand it. It's not faith as I see it in most of the world. And then you wonder why faith has trouble propagating and sustaining itself. Well, there's something about what people have done to religion. They've done things to religion to adapt to American society. And I don't think religion is better off for it. It might be better off in the immediate term. It's not better off in the medium to long term. We've made too many compromises. I believe the future of faith in America will be countercultural, will be community-based. Unless you're community-based with this type of cocoon that brings in culture, brings in education, brings in lots and lots of elements, and is distinctively, intentionally countercultural, and not just another consumer product, it will not be sustained, in my opinion.
I think this connects to a number of the ways that you talk about solving problems. There's a way that our culture now thinks about itself in broad national terms because we digest culture in ways that are not inherently local. We understand our place in ways that are, we see ourselves as parts of networks that stretch across the country in a way, but that are also smaller than our local community. How do we actually overcome them? I mean, you talk about spreading without growing, right? Taking ideas that work and helping them work in different places, but without making them bigger, without making them national, and so changing their character. In practical terms, how would that work? What does this vision of religion, for example, really look like as a practical matter for a community that's trying to help its members or for a group of people who are looking for solutions in their lives?
Well, I can give some examples. Let's give secular and let's give religious. So I think, this has been, the trajectory, of course, started farther back, but especially in the last 2 generations, everything has been nationalized to an extent that was not the case before. You could stretch this back to the progressive era, but it's most clear in the last 2 generations because of changes in transportation and other things. For a start, we need to change the ambitions of people. Right now, an ambition for a lot of people is we go to a few cities, we go far away to university, we have careers that are national. There's an organization called Lead for America, which I'm a tremendous fan for. That is an example. It is an attempt to change the aspirations of people who came from different parts of society and make them more or encourage them to be more focused on the heartland, more focused on town, more focused on rural area. Their headquarters are in Kansas. They have people in Wichita and Dodge City and southern Minnesota. These are people that I know and I talk to. That is an example of the types of initiatives we need to encourage people to change some of their aspirations. The aspirations in the past has been Washington, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and I think that's a really limited. I think we need to highlight the fact that there are there's much more young people, for example, can do when they're local and they're not national. Who wants to join a huge organization and spend the next 25 years working your way up? If you're in a town and you're 26, 25, you can do so many things you can never do in a big city. You're in a big fish in a small pond, and I think we need to think about that as a type of aspirational change for many people. And that's just career-wise. We could think about business and other economic. In terms of faith, I mean, I've had many conversations with pastors, and I think there is a desire. The question is always the chicken and egg. How do we get from here to there? But there is a desire among some people to have much thicker community. That means thicker practices. That might mean a stronger role for the Sabbath. That might mean a stronger emphasis on place. That might mean a stronger emphasis on the local. I do think it means less politics in religion. I mean, in my house, I live in you might call it a sort of religious neighborhood because it's not only religious people, it's got other people as well. But I never talk religion. I mean, there's always the small talk on the street. I have no signs on my house, in front of my house. I have no stickers on my car. I intentionally never bring up politics with people. If religion does not come up in my synagogue, I mean, right now with the war, there might comes up in that respect, but only basically on some practical level. We do not talk American politics, and I think religion will do much more if it focuses on building community, thickening practice, try to restore a place space. What was a parish? A parish was the idea that place mattered. Religion was enormously place-based historically, and to the extent that religion focuses on place, religion focuses on thickening, religion focuses on, I think religion needs to demand more of people who show up in the church or synagogue or mosque, house of worship. I don't think getting from here to there will be easy, but you have books like The Benedict Option, which certainly are calling for religion to play a different role in people's lives. And I think there is a desire, it might require, for example, the churches shrinking before they grow again. But I can say in my faith, the community thick relationship part of my faith is growing very rapidly, and roughly 1/3 of the members are people who were not religious that chose the lifestyle that we live. People want the lifestyle if you offered for them.
One institution that forces us to be grounded and focused on the particular is the school. And you talk about schooling here in a way that's not just focused on the quality of education, which obviously matters most about schools, but as a way of keeping people connected to particular human beings around them. And I think in my own life, and a lot of the friends I've made outside of the obvious kind of people I work with and so on, are people who are somehow in my children's lives for one reason or another, or parents of other children. And that is a way of building networks almost despite yourself, and finding yourself surrounded by people who you have to rely on or you have to think together with. How could schools be used in this way? And what would it mean to think of a school as a neighborhood institution in that way?
Schools are among the best incubators of relationships and networks, and I would also say spin-off institutions. I mean, we historically have thought of churches and houses of worship of playing that role, and I do think they can play that role. They should play that role. But schools are extremely undervalued in their role in strengthening community, strengthening institutions. So I strongly believe in community schools. That could be, I mean, in my neighborhood, there are several what we might call community schools. They're competitive. I am not taking anything away from the need for competition in education. I'm certainly not taking away anything about the role of charter schools might play in education. One of my chapters talks about a neighborhood in Atlanta, and one of the key elements is a charter school, being very important to revitalize the school. But the key thing we need to understand is schools are hugely important for incubating relationships. Yuval has given examples, but I can just think of, same thing with me, but it's not only the kids and the parents. It's also the kids walking to school. It's about affecting the attractiveness of a neighborhood. I mean, if a neighborhood has an attractive school, it likely will have other attractive institutions. It will likely attract people. A successful neighborhood needs to attract people, and a school is a key element of that. So there's many elements of this, but clearly in our lives today, in the United States, I would say today, given the decline of religion, schools are arguably the single best incubator of relationships and institutions on a day-to-day basis, outside of your alumni association or alumni contacts you might have got from high school or college or something like that. And so I think schools should be place-based. Schools should be things kids walk to. Parents should be very involved in schools. And the more that the schools and neighborhoods have a virtuous relationship, the more we're going to have strong relationships in the neighborhood, throughout the neighborhood, in many, many ways.
Well, I want to open things up for questions, both here and online. We can start here in the room. There'll be a microphone coming to you in just a second. Just quickly tell us who you are and ask Seth your question. We'll start up here in the front.
I want to ask you about the one thing I didn't hear you mention. My name is Joe Freeman, and I both live here and in Brooklyn, New York for the last 40 years. And the one thing I've noticed in both places is the decline of places to meet. If I wanted to call a neighborhood meeting, I have no idea where it would be held. Now, you mentioned schools. Well, my local school wants a fee of several $100s to open up a room for a meeting. Occasionally, libraries will have meeting spaces. They're much smaller, but they're only open when the library is open, which is not always in the evening when most people want to meet. No one invites anyone into their home for a meeting anymore. Maybe they did 50 years ago, but I surely hell haven't seen that. And in addition, a lot of single-family homes that were built with porches, the owners have closed them in. They prefer more inside space to outside space. So a lot of what you're talking about, except that you didn't specifically say, could be significantly improved if there were easily available, free places to meet.
So I can easily answer that. I mean, we call these places third places. First place is home, second place is work, third place are places to meet outside of home and work. So there's a term for that. And there's been an incredible decline of third places in the United States. I couldn't give you the data. Someone wrote a book about this, I don't know, 25 so years ago, and he had really good data on this subject. I think what you see is, again, we are placeless because there's no institutions and no activities and no places to have institutions or activities in our neighborhood. I mean, it so happens I'm on the board of some organization. We do meet in a neighbor's house. We do meet in a school. Sometimes we might meet in a restaurant. We have those in my neighborhood, but most places do not. Part of that is a problem of zoning. Part of that is a problem of how we've planned and developed the physical landscape. One of the very odd things about America is that we build great roads and we don't build great places. It's one of the shocking things. If you spend time, I spent a lot of time in Barcelona because the organization I co-manage happens to be based there. But imagine, a better example is Italy. You walk around Italian cities and you know what the neighborhood is by the physical element in the cities. I mean, they have neighborhood churches, they have neighborhood centers, they have neighborhood civic buildings, and architecture as well as urban planning celebrates place. In America, we have nice houses, we have very big houses, incredibly big houses from most of the world, and we have a lot of arguments about what was the big bill from government. We're going to improve our infrastructure. Well, I'd like to see if there's a role for government. The single biggest role for government actually is how it structures society. It has structured society in a way that isolates us. Part of it is the focus on roads and not places to meet. Part is this idea is that you can't have multifunctional zoning. The zoning is so isolating. Again, the most important role of government is not a policy government, it's how it structures our society to isolate us, deinstitutionalize us. This is something that is not well understood unless you compare it to other parts of the world. You're giving a great example. I mean, we may not think of that as a specific government role, but the government has laid out the physical landscape. The government has decided what can be built. The government has made the locations placeless. You shouldn't have to depend upon the school. It's a sad testament that the school is going to charge you money. I mean, every place should have a center. Every place should have places to meet. I have 3 restaurants where I can walk to where I live. I have a supermarket. It's not really designed like a neighborhood, but it works like a neighborhood center. And I think you are what you've described is an example of how most people are experiencing life in America right now.
Let's take another question here.
So if you are a student of urban planning, you probably remember a gentleman by the name of Jim Rouse, who's since passed away, but he had an idealistic vision of how communities should work, which he enacted at Columbia, Maryland, was one of the places and in which it was very organized around community centers and then spanning out from those kinds of places that you say. Now, have we drifted away from that, or have the Europeans done it better? Have they been doing it better in Italy and Spain, or is this an indictment on the American system in general of how we've been going capitalistically, going in the wrong direction and basing our commercial institutions as opposed to community institutions?
It's interesting you mentioned Columbia. I live between here and Columbia, and one of the joys, writing a book is very painful sometimes, if I may say so, but one of the joys of writing a book is all the people who contact you when they hear about your work. So one of the people that contacted me was from the library, a library in Columbia. She worked at the county library, and so she actually so much wanted to meet me. She literally came to my neighborhood and met at the cafe not far from a walking distance from where I live. And we had a big talk about Columbia. So Columbia is an exception. If you think human history up until World War II, we built out organically. There were no rules, actually. There were some rules probably from the 19th century. They have some public transportation from the 19th century. But for the most part, we developed the physical landscape very organically. Then we had this idea is that after World War II, we had a really different idea about how we should build our society. And I think one of the reasons why you have there's a lot of factors we could talk about why the United States is such an outlier compared to other developed countries in terms of its social outcomes, but clearly one of them is the size of the country and how we've built this landscape. I mean, again, you cannot run a country with 330 million people with a lot being done at the center, and you cannot encourage people to have thriving lives if you build everything around cars, because cars are isolating from one another. And again, there's this whole movement. So Columbia is an example of someone who thought about things differently. But again, Columbia is an exception. And from what I hear from people who live there, the original vision hasn't been kept up, and things have evolved in a very different direction since the original vision. The thing to understand is when I talk about European cities, we're talking about places that were built long before there were cars. I mean, some of it was, there was this concept historically that we build around neighborhoods. That is what people assumed was the way we built the physical landscape. A lot of it was organically, a lot of it was unplanned, but it led because we didn't have vehicles that there was a density. Now, my book is certainly not about urban planning. It plays a very little role, but I do think, it's so interesting that there's a whole movement, New Urbanism. I don't think they have a complete vision. They have a partial vision, but this idea that we have built the landscape to isolate ourselves certainly resonates with a lot of people. Again, this is not, I think institutions matter tremendously, and they're the key element. We have to think about how physical affects institutions. It's really important. And in my work on societies and states and everything else, there's actually a handy framework we use, structural, institutional, individual. And we always think about how that shapes. So what I did in my book in terms of thinking like that, it's right out of what we do every day in my work, actually. I mean, please.
Let's take another question right up here.
Great to see you again, Seth.
Thank you so much for coming.
George Pendleton from Shepherd Economic Development Corporation, based in Indianapolis. But two quick things, and God bless you, Seth, for convening this. About 41 years ago, Vice President George Bush gave an inaugural speech here at AEI, stressing the importance of what he quoted as mediating structures to create this balance between what government could do and what local institutions should be sopped up to do. What I want to just ask you to give a response to is that my late dad, who served in that administration, used to say, when you're green, you grow, but once you think you've ripened, that's when you've begun to rot. Is there something about the Gen X, Gen Y, what has driven this complacency to believe that we've ripened? And why, since George Bush gave that speech in 1981 as vice president, has there still been this struggle for government to accept that we need to find a better balance between what government can do and how we need to boost up those private sector and faith-based institutions to carry the load they've been doing for centuries?
First, I mean, the things that I write about, these are not new concerns. I think we've been on this trajectory for decades, and we don't know what to do about it, and things get progressively worse. So I can't blame it on a specific generation, and I certainly can't blame it on social media and technology, because technology certainly plays a role, but not our phones. Technology enables the car and everything else. I mean, you go back and read material from the 70s there was people worried about. You go back and read Nisbet. You go back, I mean, why did de Tocqueville, when de Tocqueville came and visited America and he wrote Democracy in America, he was trying to figure out why the United States was different than France. Why did the American experiment work out much better than the French experiment? And his contrast is the abundance of institutions versus the lack of these intermediate institutions. So people have been thinking about it, even think of Burke and Little Platoons. But the idea that American institutions that are decaying, you go back decades. I mean, what's scary is to read Eric Fromm's work about why the rise of authoritarianism. He's not talking about America, but he's talking about this disconnection from institutions and this look to the state for the answers and what that means. So again, people have talked about this, so I can't blame. I think, I mean, the problem is government has incentives. And again, I don't think all of this is about policy and government wanting more and more, because I believe the biggest issue is how government structures society, not a particular policy. I could disagree with a lot of policies, but it's the structuring of society. But for sure, if you focus government on functional units, there will always be a hunger to increase the number of units dispersed. That is the nature of any bureaucratic beast, however you want to describe it. If you could somehow make government focus on place-based outcomes, which I do believe is possible, but it is a radical rethink of what we know of government, that would change the incentives. We need to somehow change the incentives of how government works. That, to me, is the fundamental question. You're not going to convince arguments for me don't work. Structures work, incentives work. Arguments for me, they do not go very far, especially when you're dealing with big institutions that are, for the most part, they're not accountable for what they do.
Well, we're nearly out of time. Let me ask you one last question, Seth. If you're an American looking to address these problems, persuaded by the kind of diagnosis that you offer, where do you think it makes the most sense to start? What would you do now in your community to address the kinds of problems you're talking about?
me personally, or, well, I think for those of us who worry very much about the trajectory of the United States, I'm going to answer, and then I'll talk about individually. So for those of us who worry tremendously about the future of America, I think we need to look for entry points where change can happen. I certainly think churches are important, but I'm trying, for example, state and local governments could be entry points for change. I certainly think, again, we need to rethink the structures that shape life in this country. That is the fundamental issue. So it definitely could be. I mean, you could think of the national and the federal and the policy, but I'm really much more eager to reach local, state. I'm very eager to reach nonprofits, philanthropists. I'm very eager to reach local leaders. And there's a lot of people who are scared, worried, anxious about the problems in this country. They are thinking about it very differently than people in Washington are. They are much more sympathetic for some of the things that I discuss. I think the way people locally think about problems are so different than the way people in Washington think about problems. They experience these problems differently, and they think that there's different entry points, different ways to address them. To the extent that we can bring the policy people, and we might call them practitioners or local leaders, to the extent that we can bridge this gap and come up with more practical ways that we here in Washington can help. Again, we need to think horizontally, not vertically. And so I definitely will be trying to fill those gaps and seek out people where we can have tangible impacts. Personally, and I think this is part of your question, I would just urge everybody, if you're thinking about individually, I mean, I double down over and over again on my neighbors. It's for me, I walk down my street and I have a sense of joy because I know who's behind those doors. I have so many examples, this morning being one example, but with my neighbors. So I would be asking people, social media is great. Advocating for big policy change is great, but the more we focus on tangible people, tangible places, tangible problems, and we invest our energy in helping people, institutions, places, I think the more fulfilling we will be, the less frustrated we will be, the more we will feel we have agency and a real stake in making change happen. And if you're asking me individually, in my own private time, I don't send money. Some people ask, but I don't, for the most part, don't send money far away. I don't give my free time far away. I look for ways that I can help real people, real places, real institutions. And I would urge everyone to do the same. Thank you so much.
Seth Kaplan, thank you very much. Thanks for this book.
Thank you, Yuval, so much.